everybody, this is James Lindsay. You are listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we're talking about Canada today. I just got back from Canada. I went to Alberta, which to date, and I think probably permanently, is my favorite province. As it turns out, Alberta is one of the most inspiring places I've been. I take a lot of heart and inspiration and enthusiasm from Alberta because Canada's in trouble, but the Albertans are the most awake and feisty fight back people in Canada that I'm aware of, and they are doing a wonderful job fighting back. And when you're fighting back against those kinds of odds and you're getting organized and actually doing things that work instead of just screaming into the void, it's very inspiring to see. So I'm grateful for my time I spent in Alberta. I got to see sort of almost the midnight sun up there. It turns out that it never actually gets dark on the summer solstice. Well, it does, but just barely for a couple of hours. Yeah, it was a great trip, and I've been watching, Canada on the social media, both while I was there, in which I was kind of immersed in Canadian political topics, and since. And I've become extremely worried about a few things, but this podcast might run a little bit long. I want to do kind of a thorough exposure of the Liberal Party of Canada and its long-standing relationship to the Club of Rome, which is a big problem. That is our neo-Malthusians. That is our people who want to make sure that we avert disaster by massively reducing energy production and consumption, and in fact, massively reducing population. And they've been at it since the early 1970s, maybe late 1960s. The Club of Rome, from the beginning, from their first year, have been direct friends with the World Economic Forum. And so we're going to see a lot of cross-pollination between the World Economic Forum and its Canadian puppets. And in fact, not just the Liberal Party, but the Trudeau family. Pierre Trudeau worked very deliberately and very explicitly with the Club of Rome, and that's one of the main things I want to expose to you in this podcast. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about, I was going to make some kind of a joke about a conservative product, gold, rough greens, whatever it is that I'm supposed to market, or whatever is a conservative these days. But I want to talk to you actually about this new trend that I'm seeing. I've done a short form podcast about this as well. In Canada, where they're pushing a mass line, actually. If you don't know what a mass line is, it's way past time that you look that up. It's allegedly the line from the masses that's directed from the government. So they create a fake demand, and then they press it as a huge campaign and then stir up the masses to demand the thing they say that the masses demand, so that everybody in a huge mass of people is now pushing for the same change. And they're doing a mass line, or attempting to construct a mass line in Canada that mirrors the Chinese land reform projects and collectivization projects of the 1950s under Mao. In this case, it's not exactly land they're trying to reform. They're not going around taking farms and breaking them up and splitting them up between people and then collectivizing them so that the communists run them and everybody has the part that they're responsible for. In this case, instead, they're not divvying up land, they're trying to divvy up bedrooms. There's this narrative push about, I just keep seeing this, I've been seeing it for months and it seems to have accelerated, about how many bedrooms there are, empty bedrooms there are across Canada. Those aren't empty bedrooms, those are people's private property. But the pressure is mounting. It's kind of all over Canadian Twitter, at least, and it's coming from Trudeau himself, Justin Trudeau in this case, talking about the need to, in his case, Trudeau was talking about the need to streamline the hotel industry and even the housing industry and make sure that there's a lot of what are we talking about? Modular homes being built in order to deal with their manufactured housing crisis that's largely the result of large amounts of unsustainable immigration that the Canadian government has been facilitating. Well, they're also pointing to Canadian homes and saying, look at all these empty bedrooms. It's not just new modular constructions. It's not just that everybody can move into an apartment so that these immigrants or whoever else they decide are the willing or the deserving recipients can move into your multi-bedroom house. It is in fact that everybody is going to have to pitch in and make this transformation work for housing across Canada. It's kind of this, one of the guys I was talking to up in Canada said, one of the big differences between Canada and the United States is in the United States, there's this vibe, and it's just, we are America. I am an American. I am awesome. But in Canada, it's we are Canadians. We are awesome. And this idea of extracting a compliance really from this, collective we are instead of I am attitude is going to be weaponized against Canadians. And what will happen is predictable. People will be, there's tons of pressure on Canadian Twitter already, which is, who cares about that so much, but what the pressure is pushing for is that even grandparents, old ladies should be now trying to downsize their properties so that their multi-bedroom houses can be split up among more deserving peoples, particularly these immigrants that they have brought in. And it's time for everybody to not have more house than they're supposed to. And all this strikes me of is if Mao called it land reform in China, I see housing reform in the communist sense, which is a seizure and redistribution, even if it's just through a public pressure campaign, to seize and redistribute housing in Canada. I feel like this is a remarkable problem that's massively and quickly on the rise, and the Canadians really need to get awake to this, and they need to be very firm and very adamant in saying absolutely not. But this is all just part of the broader project that I'm going to pin to the Liberal Party, and in this case, its connection to the Club of Rome, because the idea actually is to create the destruction of the standard of living in our countries, and in particular to start to repopulate the globe, to move people around and make people deal with it. And this has been a project for the Club of Rome and its affiliates, including the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, pretty much all along. And you're going to hear this from top brass across Canada, not just Justin Trudeau, but let's listen to everybody's friend. I've got a couple of videos of everybody's friend, Chrystia Freeland, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance for Canada. She's also a straight-up WEF operative, a World Economic Forum stooge. And her job is to implement World Economic Forum-related policies and procedures in Canada. So I've got a couple of pieces. The first one here is from her graduation commencement speech at Northeastern University in 2023, which is brought to us by our BFFs over at the Western Standard, which is a Calgary production and Alberta favorite everybody should be supporting in Canada. And here's what Chrystia Freeland had to say at the time. Let's listen to the full 2 minutes.
Our time of tranquility is over, and we are living in an age of change. We're living through what President Biden, on a visit to my country in March, called an inflection point. A time of transformation, he said, that comes once every 5 or 6 generations. Now, like it or not, you are graduating into that inflection point. And as some of the very best educated people on our planet, you have the rare and precious opportunity to shape it. So, what is this inflection point? What is this upheaval which is going to the roots of humanity itself? There are many ways to describe this transformational moment, but I think they all come down to one fundamental question. Does capitalist democracy still work? That's the question being posed around kitchen tables in my country and this one, as parents wonder if our children can count on capitalist democracy's essential promise of a future more prosperous than our present. It is the question being posed in the muddy and bloodied trenches of Bakhmut as Ukraine's brave Democrats resist the invading forces of Putin's dictatorship. And it is the question being posed by our shrinking glaciers and our warming oceans, which are asking us, wordlessly but emphatically, if democratic societies can rise to the existential challenge of climate change.
So there is Chrystia Freeland saying that the conversation of both the United States and especially of Canada, which I sincerely doubt, is can capitalist democracy still work? Well, I insist that that's actually the question that's being asked of the World Economic Forum and its friends through the Club of Rome, and thus the Liberal Party of Canada, as we're going to hear. And their answer is no. And they are saying that this is the question because they want to instill doubt in this. But meanwhile, the same policies that I talked about that are creating the housing crisis, this immigration policy, is also creating an employment crisis, especially for young Canadians. So now you have this weird, terrible situation in Canada where not only can people not afford to buy a house, and there's a pressure campaign to start sharing your houses, but there's also a problem where you can't even get a decent job as a young person because there's not just an influx of lots and lots of immigrants, but there is also an enormous campaign to make sure that they are the ones who get the employment first. Something like affirmative action, but for immigrants. And this is a huge problem. And what, of course, it's going to cause is a huge amount of backlash in addition to everything else at the more direct level. But if we listen to Chrystia Freeland, what it does is it enables the Liberal Party's government to push the narrative, which I'm sure the NDP is pushing even harder, to push the narrative that capitalist democracy, as they refer to it, doesn't work. It doesn't work for our future. Look, they can't even get jobs. They can't even get houses. It has failed them. But in fact, that's not what's happened. The government deliberately, intentionally following things like the Cloward-Piven strategy, did this to the Canadian people on purpose so they could run this mass line to try to seize housing, to do housing reform in the sense of the Chinese land reform project under the CCP when Mao was in power, which was a catastrophe. It's an unbelievable disaster what happened. People destroying their own property, people destroying their own animals, people destroying their own tools and equipment, people killing themselves left, right, and center, people destroying their own farmland, people destroying their own homes when the government wasn't doing all those things for them to prevent them from being collectivized because they were so against that. Now imagine it's not your garden tools that are being collectivized, but your spare bedroom. That is an amazing thing, but this government has created it. So let's listen, in fact, to WEF puppet Chrystia Freeland talking at the Davos World Economic Forum annual meeting, I should say, in 2016. Where she laid the groundwork to turn Canada into this communist state through a new version of communism that they call stakeholder capitalism, which I've talked about on the podcast many times in the past. I encourage you to look up the word stakeholder and read or listen to everything that I've said about it. It's an incredibly important bad word today. But let's listen to another minute and a half or so of Chrystia Freeland.
And I am pleased to announce, and this is the first time we're announcing it, that we have all come together, Canada, with support from the private sector, with support from the OECD, with support from the World Economic Forum, with support from the World Bank, to launch a brand new platform. It is called Convergence, and this is a platform that is designed to bring together public, private, and philanthropic sectors to give them more transparency about what each other are doing, to invest and to give them a simplified route of vetting projects, to invest together in emerging markets projects. It's called Convergence. It is one of a kind. It's the first one ever. We're launching it and announcing it today. It will go online because we still need to get some regulatory approvals. Thank you, Switzerland. We have regulatory approval from Switzerland already. We still need to get the others. It will go live with some live projects in the second quarter of this year. The Government of Canada is contributing $23.5 million to it. I'm very proud that it is going to be hosted in the riding, in the district that I represent, in the great city of Toronto, at a wonderful innovation facility called Mars.
Okay, so that one's not as interesting, strictly speaking, but it is important because it shows that Chrystia Freeland is talking there at Davos at the annual meeting in 2016 with this intention to bring this new model of public, private, and philanthropic, as she phrases it, partnership in order to have a more transparent, which means collaborative in their crony sense, government ruling over Canada. In other words, this is an attempt to bring even more of this massive pressure that comes from the governments and the big corporations and the big nonprofits, which of course are the big leftist nonprofits, coordinating in order to create systems change under the brand name, in this case, Convergence in Canada. And so we can tell, by the way, also just as a point, that Chrystia Freeland is a fucking communist because she doesn't even pronounce Toronto correctly. I mean, I'm an American and I've teased my friends in Canada that they should be hooked on phonics and learn to pronounce the letters as they're written, Toronto, but which is how Chrystia Freeland just said it. But the fact of the matter is that Canadians don't pronounce it Toronto. Americans do, and apparently communists do. Canadians pronounce it Toronto. And we all know that. So she's an interloper. That's very obvious. Now, the jokes aside, the fact of the matter is that these plans have been being implemented and they are not new. Canada, they are not new. The Liberal Party has been selling your country out for 50 years, actually over 50 years. And I'm going to give you a taste of this. I'm going to read a fair amount from a paper. Like I said, this might run a little bit long. This is from the Canadian Journal of History, Volume 57, Issue 2 from August 2022. So it's a couple years old. It's not a super long article, but what it's titled is, and I'm going to come back to the article in a minute. It's by a gentleman named Christopher Orr, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo. And its title is Environmental Aspirations in an Unsettled Time, Pierre Trudeau, the Club of Rome, and Canadian Environmental Politics in the 1970s. So I'm going to unveil some of this history to you. I'll read just the abstract for now, but then I want to tell you a little bit more about the Club of Rome and what's behind what Chrystia Freeland is saying, what's going on with the Club of Rome and its relationship with the World Economic Forum, although I'm not going to cover that relationship. It's definitely documented by Klaus Schwab in bragging terms, for example, in his weird little book they published in 2011 called the World Economic Forum, The First 40 Years, where he brags year by year about what he did. And the Club of Rome being brought into their picture was one of the first projects that they had. And again, this is a neo-communist and neo-Malthusian death cult, more or less, that's predicating global governance and global power seizure on the idea that there are these existential threats like climate change and ecosystem depletion and, in fact, collapse that will cause massive deaths of humans unless basically we massively downscale, which is called degrowth or degrowth communism. We massively downscale our production and consumption. Our standard of living in particular has to be massively cut. Think about how much this ties into, and that we have to do so in order to prevent a massive collapse, which of course in process will kill millions or billions of people, which I think they're actually kind of intending. And as a matter of fact, Canadians are extraordinarily vulnerable. When we start screwing around with energy and we start talking about places where it routinely gets to 20 below zero, you have a recipe for a lot of people suffering in the cold and, in fact, freezing to death in the dark. I think, or freezing while they starve to death in the dark is, I think, how I've phrased it in the past. So I've got to be worried about all of my Canadian BFFs and got to try to help you guys out by telling you about how old this program is. And the reason I'm doing it is to make it very clear to you that while the NDP is certainly worse, the Liberal Party of Canada has been dedicated to this for a very long time, 50 years. And that's how you have arrived at this place. And it is past time that Canadians start to realize, unlike the UK, which just voted a gigantic Labour majority, a historic Labour majority, and decided that it wants to destroy itself with green communism, unlike them, I want Canadians to hopefully have the information to realize that the Liberal Party and the NDP are both communist parties of different flavors, one more neoliberal than the other, that are trying to radically tear apart Canada and turn it into a monster like Chrystia Freeland was just talking about. So here's what Christopher Orr says in the abstract of this paper, and like I said, I'll come back to more of it. Plagued by economic, energy, and national unity problems, the 1970s were a tumultuous time in Canadian federal politics. Much less is known about Pierre Elliott Trudeau's environmental aspirations. This article provides an account of the ideas, policies, and actions in Canadian federal politics, 1968 through 1982. This account demonstrates that Canadian leaders aspired to a transformative, ladies and gentlemen, that word means communist. Get that in your head every time you see transformative, unless it's specifically talking about something you know to be Christian, it means communism. But it demonstrates that Canadian leaders aspired to a transformative environmental agenda, including a systems approach. Hint, hint, that's communism too. They think they're the only ones who understand the systems of how everything, not just society, works. So they have to put forth a new systems approach. They're going to discredit the existing system and replace it with their system. It says also that it provides a critique of economic growth in favor of alternative visions of prosperity. That's degrowth. That's the lie that the degrowth communists tell, that true abundance comes from having more free time and having quality relationships. True abundance is not commodity abundance. It's not having stuff. True wealth is the shared commonwealth of all of the people. It's not actually having stuff. And scarcity is what's caused by capitalism, and therefore we're going to try to go to an alternative vision of prosperity, one that is communist bullshit and not prosperity at all. And that's what Chrystia Freeland's Convergence Project is actually all about, is converging the nonprofit sector, which would be your George Soros, your Tides, your Rockefeller, whatever the left-wing equivalents in Canada are and on the global stage, coordinating them with their WEF puppets, World Economic Forum puppets that are in government, and coordinating them with captured entities in the corporate world, so private, public, and nonprofit sectors converging into a single entity to critique economic growth. That means critique the idea of an increasing standard of living in favor of alternative visions of prosperity, which means in practice, when they do this because they don't know what they're doing, will mean starving while you freeze to death in the dark. While I got to see the midnight sun in Alberta on the summer solstice. On the winter solstice, I don't think there's any sun, or just barely some for a couple hours a day. So you get to starve while you freeze to death in the dark and enjoy your alternative vision of prosperity. And brought to you, again, I'm just going to hammer it, by the Liberal Party of Canada. And so this article also explains, it says, a shift in societal values from consumerism and greed. I'm going to tell you right now that means a production and consumption economy. In other words, an economy that makes stuff and can sell it. That's what it actually means. And it's going to be toward sufficiency and well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the verbiage you run into in the degrowth communism literature, where their explicit goal is to shrink our economies, stop using GDP, and define this new thing called well-being. I did a podcast on the well-being economy. You should listen to it. This is insane. So they're going to define your abundance and your alternative vision of prosperity in terms of a communist definition of well-being. Are you getting along well enough? Do you have well-being at your minimal needs satisfied level that they need to have in order to curb emissions and to curb, consumerism and greed and satisfy the impossible environmental agenda, which comes down from the Club of Rome by way of the World Economic Forum and its communist aspirations. It becomes that the Club of Rome is the tool, or the organization that's created the tools that the World Economic Forum needs in order to be able to break the West so that it can install communism here. What it says here is that the onslaught of problems in the mid-1970s was a significant turning point in Canadian environmental politics, although Trudeau did not discard, this is Pierre Trudeau, although Pierre Trudeau did not discard his holistic environmental vision. Holistic is another communist watchword, ladies and gentlemen. They're going to understand everything in a whole sense. So every little part, they understand how it fits within the bigger whole, which is the complicated systems thing that they want to bring into their totally coordinated convergent project that Chrystia Freeland is describing in 2016. Although Trudeau did not discard his holistic environmental vision, he was unable to move from environmental rhetoric to action. In other words, Pierre Trudeau wasn't able to do it because of the tumultuous politics of the 1970s. He had the desire, he had the will, he had the interest, he had the connections, but he couldn't put it into action. So he had his theory that he couldn't put into praxis. It's also Marxist. It says this analysis contributes important insights to the pitfalls of navigating unsettled times such as the 1970s and has important implications for current prospects and opportunities for change. In other words, the point of this paper isn't to criticize Pierre Trudeau or the Liberal Party for the heist that they're trying to pull off on all of Canadian society. It is, in fact, to say that they didn't go far enough. But of course it is. What else would they do, right? And so this is all going to be based off of, and it's a keyword, the limits to growth, which was the book that was published by the Club of Rome in the early 1970s that inspired both Pierre Trudeau, apparently, but also Klaus Schwab to take interest in this organization. I did a podcast on limits to growth in the past. The idea is, well, this thing's totally insane. The idea is that apparently they ran some shitty computer models using a bunch of, definitely not paid to purpose whack job scientists who convinced themselves, or just lied about it, that their models indicated that we would have a massive global collapse and that we would all go into massive poverty and starvation. We'd run out of core things like metals, like copper, for example, and what would happen is that we would therefore overshoot our environmental capacity and the whole thing would collapse. The World Economic Forum and the Club of Rome have been interested in these ideas ever since. They just keep getting repeated. I think the limits to growth is in like its fourth or fifth version where their predictions keep not coming true. So they just rewrite them with new models that come up with wrong answers yet again. And every time they do, the World Economic Forum jumps on it and is all part of it. The United Nations Sustainable Agenda is attached to all of this, not just the mentality, but also the same background. But before I continue and read some more of this paper from the University of Toronto Press about Pierre Trudeau and his governance and his relationship with the Club of Rome, I want to read to you a document from May 2024 called Earth for All, Deep Dive Paper 17. So Earth for All is a project, a nonprofit project, put forth by, as a matter of fact, the Club of Rome. And the title of this deep dive paper from Earth for All from just a couple months ago is The System Within, addressing the inner dimensions of sustainability and systems transformation. What do you think the inner dimensions are? If you guessed that this is describing a fundamental spiritual and religious transformation of people so that they adopt sustainable and inclusive beliefs and a systems orientation, in other words, a communist view of the world, then you are exactly right. So Earth for All published this. Here's the abstract. Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, a report to the Club of Rome, offers system change pathways to avoid ecological and societal collapse through extraordinary turnarounds in key policy areas. This is where we insert Norm Macdonald saying, sounds like a bunch of fucking communist gobbledygook, but okay. While ambitious policy levers are much needed, sustainable change hinges on integrating material interventions with consideration of the human inner dimension, reckoning with the deep collective structures of thought foundational to failing systems, and nurturing the inner capacities necessary to overcome barriers to collective action and structural transformation. Now, if you're new to the new discourses and to my work, I forgive you for not recognizing that you just heard communist buzzword after communist buzzword after communist buzzword, like back to back to back. Deep collective consideration, human inner dimension, deep collective structures of thought, inner capacities necessary to overcome barriers to collective action and structural transformation, with integrating material interventions with extraordinary turnarounds. In fact, it's going to appropriate the language of the Great Leap Forward unironically as we get a little further into this. I'm not going to read a ton of this. It's actually fairly long. Maybe I'll come back and do a podcast on this document itself at some point. It says, this dimension of system change, communism, and supplying systems thinkers, communists, with the language to advocate for psychological, social, and spiritual factors crucial to sustainable solutions. Oh, so it's about creating psychological, social, and spiritual change in individuals to support their destructive communist agenda. The document, it says, discusses worldviews, mindsets, values, and identity as root drivers of cultural behavior. So those are the things that they're going to remake to make you into the new man who's going to be able to make the sustainable and inclusive future, right? Do you understand that? Their interaction with psychological and behavioral tendencies. In other words, they're going to brainwash you and do training like B.F. Skinner behaviorism, what was his name? Pavlov with his dog, ring the bell and make you go recycle something. Ring the bell, go recycle something. Behavioral training, along with interaction with psychological and behavioral tendencies. What they're going to do, therefore, is brainwashing and operant conditioning of the people. And then it goes on to say, and the transformative inner capacities, in other words, changing your values, psychology, and social and spiritual dimensions of your life, your transformative inner capacities that can be cultivated to intervene at deep leverage points. In other words, fracture points and weaknesses in society, and introduce existing initiatives leading the way in integrating inner and outer dimensions of system change. And if I haven't struck you hard enough yet with the idea that systems change means communism, you need to get that firmly into your head. System change means communism. Okay, so this document there's a lot to it. It's almost 30 pages long. Well, let's read a little bit from the introduction. In the early 1970s, an iconic report to the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, sounded the alarm for unbridled economic expansion on a finite planet. That's the terms of art that they use to say that they have to have all the power in the world. 50 years later, its successor, Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity, like I told you, it's like in its fifth iteration of them making up bullshit predictions and then falling apart, so they just do it again. 50 years later, it says is successor. It should say its successor. They can't even get past the first fucking page without a typo. Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity outlines a global to-do list for averting ecological and societal breakdown within a vanishing time frame. In other words, we're now under a huge time pressure, so we've got to do all this stuff in order to save the world. In other words, hi, we're from the Club of Rome and we're the Antichrist. That's what the Antichrist does. The Antichrist says, look, the apocalypse is here, I'll save you from it, and lures people to their own destruction. Based on advanced computer modeling of system dynamics, just like they had during COVID-19, y'all, the visionary report lays out 5 extraordinary turnarounds in socioeconomic organization necessary to avoid collapse and create an equitable world within planetary limits. So within planetary limits means the communist goal of a circular managed economy, which means there's a tyrannical power that controls the entire marketplace or the entire economy. So now you have a planned and managed economy. We know where that's going to go to create an equitable world, which means equity means socialism. It means redistribution. And this is going to require 5 extraordinary turnarounds in what? In socioeconomic organization. In other words, the current, what did Chrystia Freeland call it? She called it capitalist democracy. The current system has to see 5 extraordinary turnarounds in socioeconomic organization in order to avoid the collapse that their computer models predict very conveniently for them. Never mind that this is like the 5th time they've put something out and all the other models have been wrong. Never mind that they don't understand that when things become scarce, like let's say we actually started to run out of copper, they become very expensive. And when they become very expensive, there's a huge pressure for innovation when that is allowed to occur because you're not in a totalitarian system. And you reward people who come up with the innovations. You reward people who find a workaround. Oh no, copper's become very scarce. Let's imagine. Copper's now very expensive. There is a massive incentive structure built into that circumstance in a market to figure out something that can replace copper. And whoever figures it out is going to become a fucking billionaire, which is a gigantic incentive structure. So guess what? These problems that they say, oh my God, we're going to run out of this. Oh my God, we're going to run out of that. Oh my God. These are actually the impeti, the mothers of innovation and invention. They are not problems of destruction like these doomsayers, these doom pillars who want to steal all of the power using your fears. They're not the engines of disaster that they portray. They are engines of innovation. And these innovations unlock new levels of actual sustainability for human populations and standards of living because they represent, when you find them, massive increases in efficiency, massive increases in capacity to deliver the same goods and services with less energy and input. Earth for All, on the other hand, they say, outlines ambitious levers for system change in policy areas of poverty, inequality, empowerment of women, energy, and food. So they're not going to solve poverty. That's bullshit. They don't have the slightest idea what causes poverty. It's not systems. They're not going to solve inequality for the same reason. Their empowerment of women. Could we get more tired of something? Like, we've been doing that for 50 fucking years. It's not working. The empowerment of women, like, really? That's not how you empower women. You empower women by creating a safe, stable structure around them that allows their femininity to flourish. This isn't complicated. And then they're going to intervene in energy and food. Guess what? That's called energy and food scarcity, with which they're going to control populations. But like I said, this is a lot like China. This is a lot like China under Mao. So we're looking at energy and food as kind of like steel and grain in the so-called Great Leap Forward. But in this case, in the West, we're not aiming to Great Leap Forward. We're not aiming to have gigantic production. Mao's goal was to take China and get it ahead of the United Kingdom in production in under 15 years, ideally 3, which turned out to destroy his country. Well, as it turns out, the goal here isn't to do that. Our goal is actually in the West to lower our energy consumption and standard of living to somewhere around the third world in order to prove how great and sustainable and inclusive we are. But here, I digress. Let me read from them some more. The report advises that, quote, only when we pull these bold levers early and strongly will we see accelerated transformation, which means rushing into communism, toward a sufficiently fair, just, and safe world. Fair, just, and safe world, when written by communists, means communism. Get it in your head. When they say this shit, they don't mean normal stuff. They mean communism. Everything good that they say means communism. Everything bad that they say means enemy of communism. It's that simple. So those are the levers, though. Poverty, inequality, these are the manipulation points. Empowerment of women, energy, and food. They say these levers themselves receive detailed treatment, which I'm not going to cover. However, a more elusive factor in this important equation concerns the we, who must pull them. Oh, who's going to control all this? Who's going to pull these levers of destruction on your society? Well, I bet you it's going to be the converged, Chrystia Freeland, I bet you it's going to be the converged nonprofit, public, and private sectors who are all coordinating in a gigantic cartel that's almost certainly a racketeering scam being used to defraud and destroy and loot the treasuries of our countries. So the paper seeks to catalyze Earth for All's call to action by asking, who are we? So they want to know, who are we? Oh, it's not going to be us, the stakeholders, the Soviets, the party. It's going to be us, we, everybody. We are Canadians, for example. What qualities limit us? What strengths do we possess? You see, now it's everybody, but it's not. They're the ones pulling the levers, but they're going to try to get people to do it from underneath. When they motivate the public to have a belief and make a huge demand and then push a propaganda campaign to do that, to make the public demand their change that they want to implement, that's called a mass line. That is what the Chinese communists perfected, was the mass line, to make everybody believe the masses demand it. The leaders are not to be held responsible. The masses demanded these changes. So we're going to ask ourselves, what qualities limit us? What strengths do we possess? In what ways are our human frailties fundamental within our failing systems? In other words, in what ways is it our fault? Notice that they just assume our systems are failing. They don't actually prove our systems are failing. They're just breaking them and then saying the systems are failing. And here's the kicker, right? Here's the punchline. And who must we become to exercise collective agency at the necessary unprecedented scale? Okay, let's talk about this. Exercising collective agency means communism. Who must we become to exercise collective agency at the necessary unprecedented scale, like when Mao mobilized the 600 million peasants of China to their own mass death? 1 out of 6 of them maybe died as a result of his programs. Who must we become? You must become the new Soviet man, or the new man, or the sustainable inclusive man, or a global citizen. You have to transform yourself on a spiritual and values-based level. That's what's going on underneath all of this. This is what the Liberal Party is trying to foist on you, Canada. And the NDP, again, is worse. What they are trying to foist upon you is a fundamental change in your religious disposition to believe their crackpot world religion that just so happens to get you mired down in this guilt and shame and confused level of spiritual transformation while they happen to pull all the levers of power. And now you are going to share your freaking bedrooms with people in housing reform. It says the material aspects of the global crises we face are well understood. No, they're not. That's all lies. Energy systems, dangerous emissions, biosphere destruction, income, agriculture, food security. Less well understood is why. Despite having the policy instruments, the technologies, and the resources available to address them, we still aren't doing so at anywhere near an appropriate rate. So to fill this stark gap in our understanding requires a perspective on system change, communism, that reaches beyond, like religious, like transcendent, or rather within external structures and strategies. Remember when Herbert Marcuse said that the ideal society is contained within the present society, but we need to criticize away those elements we don't like? So maybe it's that the perspective on system change exists within external structures and strategies to the human mind that built and maintained them. Oh, so we have to change who we are. As such, this deep dive paper calls urgently for attention to the underexplored inner dimension of system change. In other words, the Club of Rome, because it hasn't been able to achieve its goals yet with its partners in the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and clearly the Canadian government, as we're going to hear, the Liberal Party in particular, all of that, they still haven't been able to force the world to buy their garbage. And so now they're going to focus on the inner dimension. They're going to try to awaken a sustainable and inclusive spirituality for you as a new religion. So defining the inner dimension, it says in a little box. No verbal definition of the inner world could possibly be complete. Oh, you'll know it when you see it, because they're Gnostic wizards. Arguably, the more precise, the less accurate we would be in naming the boundless, multifaceted arena of human thought and experience, and we mean purposefully to avoid limiting the reader in their conception of it. So it's all in the imagination. In fact, that's all throughout this, which guess what? That's exactly what communism is about. You can imagine a communist world, so obviously we can work to build one, and people can just be remade in order to achieve it. Generally, however, when we say inner, we mean the domain of cognition, emotion, consciousness, and culture, a complex interplay between individual, subjective experience, unconscious processes, and neurophysiology, interpersonal relationships, collective beliefs, and social constructs. It is contrasted by the material outer world of landscapes and objects, but neither realm is truly separate or distinct. This is straight Marxist ontology at this point, and both exist in dynamic interdependence, continuously influencing and informing one another. A little bit more from the introduction. I think I'll probably get through most of it and skim a little bit of the document for you. The inner conditions have played that inner conditions have played a central role in creating and maintaining our current crises seems in one sense too obvious to mention, and yet this fact is too often absent from high-level solutions analysis. Let me reread that in the original Communist. That bourgeois values have played a central role in creating and maintaining our current crisis against socialism seems in one sense to be too obvious to mention, yet this fact is too often absent from high-level solutions analysis. That's exactly what they're actually saying. People have the wrong values. They have bourgeois values, as the Marxists would put it, and those bourgeois values have to be transformed through inner work. Inner work, as Mao called it, ideological remolding, or sometimes translated as thought reform, or just brainwashing. The shifting values and evolutionary impulses. So this ties into all the weird UN stuff I've been telling you. They've been trying to control the evolution of man and the planet. The shifting values and evolutionary impulses underpinning escalating consumerism, the rise of individualism and fragmentation of collective identity, the biases and emotions that drive our political behavior, there's so many not sentences in this, it's amazing. All are forever present and active, pulling the levers of our outer world. And as vested interests are more than aware, they are susceptible to influence. As a matter of course, we allow commercial and political forces to manipulate the human inner world in ways directly contributing to our polycrisis. So there's your standard World Economic Forum buzzword. The great narrative for the better future, as Klaus Schwab put it, was that we have the poly crisis, which is all these existential crises all at once, including black swans. P.S. It's not a black swan if it's a white swan that they painted black in an intelligence lab. But at any rate, in other words, if they manufacture a black swan rare event that's world-changing, they manufactured it. It wasn't a black swan. It was a fucking false flag. But anyway, polycrisis is the great narrative for the better future is that the polycrisis is the reason why we need greater global coordination through the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, and by proxy, their real master, the CCP. But as wisdom traditions and science unequivocally show, because in their religion, by the way, all religions, philosophies, science, and so on are actually just pieces of the same story, and they happen to know more of the whole story, and they're going to therefore guide spiritual evolution of people. But as wisdom traditions and science unequivocally show, we are also capable of understanding, nurturing, transforming, and maturing our views, qualities, and capacities in ways that support the flourishing of the whole. In other words, what they're saying is we can become more collectivist. We just have to be willing to do the inner transformational work. This is absolutely communist garbage. The inner, then, is not simply an elective complement to systems change approaches, but an inseparable, primordial, and unavoidable aspect of human-made systems themselves. It is written through every external structure and interaction, and as such, the language of Donella Meadows, the co-author of The Limits to Growth, represents a deep leverage point for change. In other words, they can use people's values by transforming them to transform the world in the direction of their collectivist totalitarian nightmare that will kill billions of people. Canada, this is you. Indeed, while consideration of the inner has become lost amid more structural concerns in recent decades, it was integral to the founding vision of the Club of Rome. In The Human Quality, founder Aurelio Pecci, we're going to hear more about him soon, emphasized that inner change is foundational to necessary structural transformation. Are you getting the picture yet? This is a religion. Their religion of communism, and they're trying to force people to transform themselves in line with it. Earth for All's analysis and recommendations do touch on aspects of the inner. For example, social trust is emphasized, albeit as a mediator between external factors such as financial equality and political effectiveness. Now, where have I heard that phrasing before? That we need social trust that is mediating between external factors like financial equality and political effectiveness. Well, financial equality, by the way, is socialism. Hint, hint. Political effectiveness is their ability to take things over. But actually, that is actually the given justification in the document held at Stanford, the translated document from 2014, where the Chinese government explains why they want to build a social credit system. That's actually right there the purpose, because you will increase social trust by identifying who the bad elements are, whether they're financially irresponsible in one way or another. Maybe they don't pay their bills, or maybe they hoard money or grain or whatever to themselves, or they're political dissidents, which causes fracturing and it causes division. So social trust as mediated through financial and political structures or factors is the word I'm looking for, is actually the given justification by the Chinese Communist Party for why they wanted to build a social credit system in the first place. And what is the social credit system supposed to measure if it were in its most advanced state? How healthy the community and the individuals in it are, and a sense of this broad understanding of well-being. So what's the next word in this document? Well-being, while treated as an end in itself, is largely reduced to a function of external variables such as disposable income and government services per capita. Okay, first of all, no the fuck it's not. Government services per capita is not a measurement of well-being. That's a measurement of your government taking your money and setting it on fire instead of letting you do something that would increase your well-being. Your well-being is overwhelmingly connected to your standard of living, which is overwhelmingly what they're trying to destroy and lower on purpose. So don't let these people lie to you with all of this garbage. Left unexplored, they say, are myriad other dependencies of structural dynamics upon hearts and minds. Likewise, the important ways in which inner conditions can meaningfully be addressed directly. The absence This absence reflects a blind spot in wider cultures of sense-making, understandable at the time the report was published, yet just 2 years on, pioneering initiatives have begun a significant shift. Consideration of the inner dimensions of systems is entering the mainstream. In other words, they're running a huge propaganda program on it. Here, we aim to equip the reader with a very basic introduction to this critical, neglected dimension of the system's landscape, or in other words, of communist programming. Readers may be familiar with some or all concepts. Our intention is less to break new ground than to provide language and synthesis that can enable more confident discussion and inclusion of the inner in systems and complexity thinking and transformative approaches. All of that you just heard, systems and complexity thinking and transformative approaches, are just standard communist lies yet again. Everything's so systematic and complex, and only we really understand how it all works, and we only understand how to change it so that it works better, so therefore give us all the power. And what they're talking about here is creating a religious transformation in people. Here's how they summarize the document, and then I'll kind of skim a little bit to give you a flavor of it, and then we're going to go back to Pierre Trudeau to talk about the Liberal Party of Canada. Section 1 provides some historical context. How have we reached a situation where the inner dimensions of systems is so widely deprioritized in public discourse? Section 2 introduces some elements of the essential inner and their importance to sustainable transformation. 2.1 considers the profound changes in systems of thought and relationship with the world that are possible over the medium to long term. 2.2 considers certain inner states, traits, and capacities foundational to those changes and to societal well-being, which individuals and groups can be empowered to transform through evidence-based practices, like social-emotional learning, for sure. Section 3 goes on to introduce existing applications that are putting these insights into practice in the service of system transformation and sustainability, that is, communism. We won't claim that inner factors alone are enough to summon the necessary turnarounds, like demons, but we will insist that the external levers will never be sufficient either. The physical and psychological dimensions of systems are fundamentally inseparable. In other words, subjective and objective are actually in a dialectical relationship, for those of you who are keeping up with their actual ontology. And effective approaches must integrate both. In her own deep dive paper, Memphela that's not a real fucking name. Mamphela, Mamphela, Ramphela? Ramphele, that's not a real name. Honorary president of the Club of Rome, noticed that, quote, living systems change requires holistic rather than fragmented approaches. It's still the same Hegelian Marxist trash. In the coming pages, we offer ways of including the inner that can support more holistic views, models, and interventions, affording the psycho-social, spiritual conditions for collective action, due consideration in the complex picture of systems change. Humanity's future well-being depends on restoring agency in this neglected inner domain. So what they're literally saying is that their religion is necessary to save the world. So what is this? Let's just skim a little bit of this, so then we'll go to Pierre Trudeau. I know it's going to be a lot, but 1, historical context. What's the first thing they say? Beyond the Enlightenment way of looking. So this is an anti-Enlightenment move. So basically everything since the Enlightenment that has enabled the massive rise of standard of living, the massive destruction of poverty or reduction of poverty, the massive reduction of, basically every huge societal ill that you can imagine that is simply tameable. All of that, we need to now look beyond that. We need to think past that. It's time to go, they'll say transcendent to the Enlightenment, but what they actually mean is to an anti-Enlightenment perspective. And they say, in expanding perspectives on system change beyond the external world, it is helpful to understand the forces that led dominant cultures to deprioritize and oversimplify the inner forces that were themselves an inner phenomenon and which shaped the complex crises we face today. The Enlightenment worldview, rooted in the embrace of empiricism, that's evidence, reductionism, and rationalism, which means the elevation of reason to tame and control the passions, the emotions, allowed its 18th century European proponents to comprehend and manipulate the material world with remarkable success, undeniably propelling human progress. Consequently, from vaccines and antibiotics to hot showers and holidays, the average person in high-income countries now enjoys standards of living that even royalty of bygone eras could not have imagined. However, the most powerful ideas of that time have also given rise to the existential threats we now grapple with. While this worldview is far from universal, it is no coincidence that it is foundational in those cultures of modernity that bear the most responsibility for our current, it doesn't say manufactured, but manufactured crises. And then it goes on to talk about all of the problems of the Enlightenment. And as a matter of fact, if you were reading this, you would think that you're reading one of these far-right doomer reactionaries talking about reductionism, separation, disconnection, and the need for interconnection to heal us, materialism being a problem, rationalism being a problem, on and on and on. And then it contrasts this with the elements of the essential inner. And it says, here we offer a rudimentary outline of inner-outer dynamics. Read that as the subjective-objective dialectic if you're paying attention to what's really going on. Crucial to sustainable transformation, which means using Marxist dialectical techniques to transform your values so that you will be a Marxist. In other words, becoming the new Marxist man in the 21st century mold, which is sustainable and inclusive. Plus, wishing to accelerate the transformation, just like Mao's Great Leap Forward into the dust. Section 2.1 introduces certain abstract systems meaning mental models with conceptual content, blah, 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 blah. But they're really clear that this is about subjective states, psychological traits, transformative capacities, such that, in big, bold letters, any serious effort to confront the pressing issues we face as a species must, as the maxim goes, get beyond the kind of thinking that created them. In other words, you have to have a evolutionary or quantum leap in human spiritual status. And the point is that the inner dimensions of the system are in every way as complex as the outer, which is a daunting thought perhaps until we consider the extent of humanity's collective power to intervene in this territory. In other words, you can create massive social pressure to change people's values. So then they go on with systems of meaning and mindsets, worldviews, and paradigms. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. That's quoting Albert Einstein to try to make themselves look smart and thoughtful. But you know what this is all about. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's all about how we're going to use social paradigms to transform people's values. And in fact, the next section is called Values. 2.1.2, Values. You're quoting Mahatma Gandhi, your values become your destiny. So here they're very clear that they're going to start talking about intrinsic and extrinsic values and this idea of transforming your values towards sustainability and inclusion. This is a religion. This is the Club of Rome. I want you to keep that in mind because I'm about to go back to Pierre Trudeau and explain to you how Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada for 50 years have been subscribed to this religious transformation of Canada in line with becoming Marxist new men. The next section is called Individual and Collective Identity. We belong to each other, it says, quoting Thich Nhat Hanh, their favorite poet. We cannot cut reality into pieces. Every side is our side. No, the communists are most fucking definitely not on our side. They are a destructive parasite that needs to be held out of power everywhere in the world for the rest of time. They are not on our side. Every side is not our side. There are people who want to destroy our way of life, who want to control other people, and there are people who are fundamentally operating in a parasitic ideology that drains institutions and countries of their resources to the mass death of their citizens or collapse of their institutions. Implicit, they say, in the operation of values, identity is another key aspect of mindset, a collection of perceptions and stories about what it means to be me or us. Blah, 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 collective behavior. Historically, for example, in a period when China identified with an interdependent, harmonic web of life and deployed its immense navy with restraint, a European imperative to dominate and exploit the world was strongly influenced by a biblical notion of human power over a hostile natural world, resurgent in Enlightenment thought. So here they go with all of this. Circle of empathy, the deeper store of humanity, the African Ubuntu, for fuck's sake, indigenous wisdoms, self-expanding emotions. This is religious gobbledygook. And then the next section, appropriately, is religion, spiritual sensibility, and existential inquiry, quoting from the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change. Sorry, I'm laughing. If we each offer the best of our respective traditions, we may yet see a way through our difficulties. Religion, they say, remains a primary unifying force in collective identities across the world. Despite the rise of secular individualism, 85% of people globally still identify with a religion. That is what Rick Warren said in 2008 at the World Economic Forum meeting, threatening them that 5 out of 6 people on the planet are religious, and that the World Economic Forum better figure out the values dimension and the religious dimension and basically give him a cut into it, or else they're never going to get their transformation. It's not going to be enough to have a public and private partnership. You're going to have a public-private spiritual partnership, which will be the third leg of the stool. In other words, you're going to have to infiltrate the religions and transform people's values, and that's been a World Economic Forum mission ever since. Self-transcendent, planetary stewardship. I'm just reading the bold words: existential questions, spiritual sensibility. This is what I'm saying. What does it say here? To achieve the extraordinary turnarounds will depend on a measure of soul-searching across society, and a sense of the sacred, whatever shape it takes, is profoundly relevant to sustainability challenges. Global crises raise existential questions, individual and collective. They can't leave that one out. They always have to make an excuse to talk about collectivism. Why do we exist? What's my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? What are my responsibilities toward the collective? Jesus. Religious frameworks and spiritual inquiry tend to support people in exploring such questions in secular contexts. There is a growing need to develop a similar capacity. Okay, so now listen. I know this is a podcast primarily for Canada, but let me tell you about the United States. In the United States, we have our First Amendment. Our First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, which is not exactly how it's worded. As a matter of fact, there are 2 clauses representing religion. One is called the Establishment Clause, which is it. Congress will make no law regarding the establishment of religion. The other is called the Free Exercise Clause, which continues that sentence and says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay, so we have the Free Exercise Clause. In other words, the government can't interfere with your practice of religion. In other words, they can't actually pressure your churches to change their values in line with the sustainable bullshit. And then there's the Establishment Clause, that the government itself cannot establish religion. Now, I realize that you don't have that in Canada, but that's not why I'm bringing this up. I just want you to understand what we're seeing here. So for centuries, there have been fights, 2.5 centuries now, there have been fights over what that means. Every constitutional provision has been battled out in the courts throughout all of American history. And in the late 1980s, a guy named Ben Clements, if it's maybe late 1990s, I think it's late 1980s, 89 if I'm not wrong, did a law review of all of the First Amendment jurisprudence about the Establishment Clause to try to narrow down how on earth should we define religion for First Amendment jurisprudence. And what he said is that it has to be a comprehensive system of belief and practice. That's quality number 1. That gives fundamental answers to questions about the world and man's role in it. That's number 2. Such that it inspires duties of conscience. That's characteristic number 3. Global crises raise existential questions. Let's read that paragraph again. Individual and collective. Why do we exist? What's my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? What are my responsibilities toward the collective? Those are fundamentally religious questions. Here we have the Club of Rome trying to organize a comprehensive system of belief and practice based on sustainability and inclusion and global transformation into communism. And they have said that at the center of this is an inner growth dimension that is based off of fundamental questions about the world and what it means to live in it. Why do we exist? What's my relationship to the world that will persist beyond my lifetime? Those are religious questions. Such that 3, it gives rise to duties of conscience, which are things you're required to act upon in keeping with the morality of your religion. What are my responsibilities toward the collective? So this is a collectivist religion, according to First Amendment jurisprudence in the United States, absolutely clearly. I could go on and on about this. It's really horrifying. Inner states, traits, and capacities. They break it all down. Liberating attention, reclaiming agency, overcoming bias to see clearly. These are the section titles: developing sense-making, grasping complexity. That means learning to see things through their Marxist lens, activating imagination, like I told you, unleashing possibility, promoting resilience. That's one of their magic words, guys. If you see that, you're dealing with communists. Mitigating threat response. They're talking about psychological resilience, ecological resilience, trauma, of fucking course. Cultivating the heart, embodying connection. This is religion. And then its applications and action. I'm not going to talk about that in particular. I just wanted to give you a taste of this document. This is where the Club of Rome sits today. Okay, I'm just going to read this one last little bit for you from the conclusion. Earth for All acknowledges that in capital letters, giant leap toward an equitable, ecological global system will require, quote, active governments willing to reshape markets and drive long-term visions for societies, end quote. A giant leap. Really? A great leap, maybe? A great leap forward, just like the Chinese. Except, again, this is a great leap backwards. We're not leaping forward into production, which is what the Chinese attempted to do. We're leaping backwards out of production and into bullshit called sustainable and inclusion. It says, it goes on, it says it again, needless to say, if this were our current state of governments, capably oriented toward global cooperation, communism, in the long term, planetary interest, communist control, not to mention energized by an ambitious public mandate, mass line, this is all communism, this is all Maoism, then something like the giant leap scenario would be in progress already. They're literally calling it a giant leap. Great Reset wasn't good enough for you. Great leap forward, giant leap into sustainable, equitable, ecological global systems. This is, every alarm bell you have should be ringing. This is them. This is the Club of Rome. The last paragraph says, knowing only that our world will change beyond recognition, we have an opportunity to consider what foundations we would wish to build change upon. So change is inevitable. There's nothing you can do to stop it. We just have to get in the right direction, and you'll be rewarded if you do, and you'll be punished if you don't. Straight Maoist compliance tactics. Permitting ourselves at this late hour to imagine a giant leap in socioeconomic transformation. Hello, Mao Zedong. We must likewise imagine the great shift in inner conditions that would allow it. In other words, if we want to have a great leap forward, everybody's going to have to ideologically remold themselves to have the values that advance socialism or sustainability or inclusion. This is Mao exactly. Okay, so that's also the Club of Rome. This is Mao exactly. This is Maoism precisely. Couldn't be more clear, and it's the Club of Rome. Now, we were talking about Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada and its relationship to the Club of Rome going all the way back. In the 1970s, I got to try to be dramatic and mess that up. The 1970s were a tumultuous time in Canadian federal politics. This is what Christopher Orr is telling us in that paper from the University of Toronto Press. Following Trudeau mania in 1968, politics remained energized by the figure of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. While the economy, energy, and national unity were dominant concerns, the economy was troubled by persistent stagflation and then the imposition of wage and price controls and an increasing deficit. Energy policy was punctuated by two organizations of the petroleum exporting countries, that is OPEC, crises, the creation of Petro-Canada, the nationalist policy of the Foreign Investment Review Agency, and the polarizing influence of the 1980 National Energy Program. National unity raised its head during the 1970 October crisis through Western alienation, with the 1976 election of the Parti Québécois under René Lévesque. I'm sorry, French people. I apologize. I tried. And the Quebec referendum in 1980. These are issues that have captivated Canadians. This was also the era in which Canadian environmental governance formally emerged. I should really do that whole sentence again just so you can hear it correctly. This was also the era in which Canadian environmental governance formally emerged during Trudeau mania, which would be when Pierre Trudeau and his Liberal Party took control of the government in 1968. which was a kind of high tide for cultural Marxism, or critical Marxism more specifically. Environmental governance is the way a society collectively directs itself. Listen to how often you're hearing the same words. Collectively directs itself in relation to the environment, and this refers to the visions, decisions, policies, institutions, laws, and actions by which a society holistically directs itself. Are you noticing that this is the same language from the cult we just heard from? According to this definition, leaders and governments do not hold ultimate power or make decisions in isolation. Many other factors influence how society collectively governs itself. As such, although there are many precursors to Canadian environmental governance, academics present Trudeau's tenure during the 1970s as the formal beginning of Canadian environmental governance. So we can think Trudeau Sr., sorta. We know what we're talking about here, right? Everybody knows that Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau are probably not related. Like, everybody kind of knows that, right? Anyway, we can blame Pierre Trudeau in the 1970s for beginning this Canadian environmental governance. And I would say that's tied to the Club of Rome, except you would need evidence for that. But that's actually the whole point of this frickin' paper, is that it was all based off of his relationship with the Club of Rome, which we just heard about, which is unambiguously a religious death cult based on communist ideas about sustainability and inclusion and governance. It says, indeed, the Department of the Environment, DOE, was created in 1971. That would be under Pierre Trudeau's government, and more environmental laws were passed in the 1970s than in the previous 100 years. Throughout Trudeau's tenure, historians have documented the development of specific issues in Canadian environmental politics, such as Great Lakes pollution, renewable energy, and automotive pollution. However, much less is known about Trudeau's role in shaping Canadian environmental governance in the 1970s. Trudeau's environmental ambition is presented as fleeting, waning after the environmental enthusiasm of the 1960s faded. Three people, whose names don't matter, Dorn, Ald, and Stoney, argue that the Trudeau regime, quote, did not systematically attend to the environmental policy and governance, end quote. They claim that under Trudeau, the 1970s had promising environmental beginnings, but the effectiveness of environmental policy experienced a long decline. Thus, environmental ideas and policies in the 1970s are often treated as nascent, with little to be explained. These claims are troubling, given that as Canada is a parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister and Cabinet have power over the budget and are at the center of environmental policy making and law. So the argument here is that Trudeau had great environmental aspirations, Trudeau mania kicked off, and that he didn't actually get very much done, and the reason are some of these external factors that actually hampered Liberal Party power. It says little is known about Trudeau's environmental views, their extent, and how they fit into his thinking. His ideas were complex, ranging from idealistic to pragmatic. They evolved through his tenure. Nowhere in there does it say empirical or rational. It says idealistic and pragmatic. If it works, I guess. They evolved through his tenure and often did not fit standard labels such as liberal, progressive, or nationalist. Much attention has been paid to Trudeau's positions on national unity, the economy, and energy, which dominated the 1970s, while others have focused on his approach to foreign policy, his political appeal, or repatriation of the Constitution. These works pay scant attention to the environment and have overwhelmingly concluded that the environment was not a priority for Trudeau. However, there is tantalizing evidence to the contrary. So this guy is digging up the fact that the broad consensus so far has been that Trudeau's government in the 60s and 70s didn't particularly, through 82 I guess, didn't particularly give a crap about the environment, which is the prevailing view. But lo and behold, there's evidence to the contrary. In fact, he was very interested in the environment. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that he did an awful lot to restructure, not just through the creation of the Department of the Environment, but to restructure Canadian politics and Liberal Party priorities in line with the views of the Club of Rome. So here's what it says. However, there is tantalizing evidence to the contrary. Although he was a prolific writer, Trudeau wrote nothing during his 20 years in politics. Even so, some of his earliest and latest writings suggest that the environment was important to him. Studies that have looked closely at Canadian environmental politics in the 1970s suggest a surprising depth of thinking and strength of initiatives, not only during Trudeau's first term, 1968 through 72, but also enduring throughout the decade. For instance, Trudeau met with the Club of Rome at least 3 times before the Department of Environment was created in 1971. Ooh. For instance, Pierre Trudeau, met with the Club of Rome, which we just heard is a communist death cult, at least 3 times before the Department of Environment was created in 1971, and the Trudeau administration initially attempted to implement a systems approach with the Department of Environment. But that's exactly what we just heard we need new values in order to be able to get to. It was a systems approach. But that's what the Trudeau administration and the Liberal Party around him were attempting to bring into the Department of Environment in Canada in the early 1970s. Over 50 years ago. Trudeau was actively involved in these early debates about the DOE's mandate. Shortly thereafter, the Science Council of Canada developed the idea of the Conserver Society. The result in 1978 was the largest federal investment in renewable energy to date. First-hand accounts from this period also indicate that the Trudeau administration held environmental views that deeply challenged the status quo. Former Liberal Minister of Environment John Roberts viewed the Mulroney government's adoption of sustainable development as a setback and dilution of environmental ambition when compared to the Trudeau years. So adopting sustainable development was a setback as compared to the aggressive environmental systems, aka communist control mechanisms of Trudeau in the 60s, in his early 70s actually, and his meetings with the Club of Rome and the priorities of his Liberal Party that were aligned as such. So it asks the question, were Trudeau's early environmental ambitions as fleeting as some have suggested, or more persistent and profound than has been recognized? How can we reconcile Trudeau's early transformative, there's the word again, perspective and ambition on the environment with what is often seen as the disappointing and relatively anti-ecological outcome of the 1970s? And why did the Trudeau government fail to live up to its own environmental rhetoric? This article draws on diverse sources to illuminate environmental and economic ideas, policies, actions in Canadian federal politics, 1968 to 1982. This evidence reveals a novel account of Canadian environmental politics, demonstrating 2 seemingly contradictory things. On the one hand, Trudeau's environmental aspirations in the 1970s were much more ambitious, integrative, and far-reaching than previously thought. He persistently voiced and initially supported a transformative communist environmental agenda that included a systems approach, communist, which he got from the Club of Rome, rejection of economic growth in favor of an alternative view of prosperity. Holy shit. That's the exact same sentence from the other thing. And a shift in societal values from consumerism and greed towards sufficiency and well-being, the well-being economy that we just heard so much about from the Club of Rome. This isn't new. This has been the Liberal Party since Pierre Trudeau mania. With the onslaught of economic, energy, and national unity problems of the mid-1970s, Trudeau did not discard his environmental concerns, but continued to articulate this holistic environmental vision. Communist, 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 communist. On the other hand, the Trudeau government's environmental policies and actions did not match his rhetoric. The 1970s were fraught with persistent problems. Following Trudeau's near-electoral loss in 1972, he changed his staff and strategy, purging his inner circle of systems thinkers. In other words, he almost lost, so he got rid of some of the communists to kind of liberalize his party. He changed his staff and strategy, purging his inner circle of system thinkers, interdepartmental tensions underlain by ideological differences, the structure of Canada's federal system, and the long-term nature of environmental problems all contributed to Trudeau's inability to move from rhetoric to action on his transformative environmental vision. While much has changed since Trudeau's tenure, we are still struggling with many of the challenges he faced at the birth of Canadian environmental governance. Okay, so this sounds an awful lot like the Club of Rome thing, doesn't it? It's very similar to the Club of Rome thing. In fact, that's probably where the ideas came from. But what we're seeing is that Trudeau ran into political and other problems, could not implement his vision, and it all had to kind of get backburnered. Just like with the Club of Rome when its predictions kept failing. So early environmental aspirations in Canadian politics, 1968 to 1972. I'm not going to read through this whole thing. It's not all that long, but I'm not going to drag all the way through it. But I want to get really clear in all of your minds that his relationship with the Club of Rome was not superficial. Before the 1970s, Canadian environmental governance existed as separate domains that would only be brought together under Trudeau. See that? So he unified the environmental governance program. Canadian environmental governance is rooted in some of the earliest and most influential relationships linking Canada with the world through fish, fur, and timber, but attention to the environment was implicit. Canada was largely treated as a storehouse for natural resources to be exploited. During the 1990s, the environment was given explicit attention through forest conservation and national parks. Through the 1900s. The environment was given explicit attention through forest conservation and national parks, as well as energy development, pipelines, and oil spills. Regulations were developed to manage natural resources efficiently and protect them from over-exploitation. Now, obviously, nobody's against the idea of over-exploitation, but we also know that they do these federal land grabs, both in the United States and Canada, in order to control people's ability to be productive. When it says stuff like that Canada was largely treated as a storehouse for natural resources to be exploited, let me just tell you where prosperity comes from in most places and in most countries. It doesn't come from people working at Starbucks, although that's an important facet of the service economy. It comes from exploiting your natural resources. You can take a dirt poor country and discover something like lithium or cobalt in it, and all of a sudden it's not a dirt poor country. See Australia. It's amazing what can happen. You can take a dirt poor area of shithole desert and discover that it has huge oil fields under it, and it becomes one of the richest places on earth, like the Middle East. This is actually how you do it, but that's not what they wanted because Trudeau's Canadian environmental governance was rooted in some of the earliest and most influential relationships, and his goal was to do the opposite. Now, I forgot to say something in the previous paragraph before this, which was, things didn't work out for Trudeau. And so they weren't able to implement his vision. But what is this Club of Rome document about? It's about changing the values of everyday people, in particular, in this case, everyday Canadians, to get on board with this so that the political conditions around the Liberal Party government will be able, or NDP even worse, will be able to implement this bullshit on behalf of the World Economic Forum, United Nations, and ultimately CCP, which at least the CCP knows is designed, I think the others do too, is designed to actually destroy Canada so that it doesn't have the capacity to have a high enough standard of living and a sense of freedom so that its people can stand on their own 2 feet against tyrants. It's in fact to drag them into a tyranny that they can't escape. Okay, so back to this. The environmental movement emerged full force in the 1950s and 1960s as people began to notice the impacts of humans on the environment. In Lost in the Barrens and Never Cry Wolf, Farley Mowat captured Canadians' imaginations, drawing attention to environmental issues, including human arrogance toward Indigenous peoples and wildlife. So notice that they used art and culture to influence a generation of hippies. The Canadian environmental movement was also influenced by the environmental revolution in the United States. Landmark books, again, culture to influence, such as Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac and Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, criticized rampant post-World War II industrialization and the destructive ecological impacts of uncontrolled scientific and technological development, most notably DDT and nuclear fallout. Prominent economists and politicians also began to question the environmental merits of industrial society and its pursuit of unbridled economic growth. In The Affluent Society, Canadian-born economist G.K. Galbraith criticized economic GDP growth as a poor measure of society's well-being. So there's your well-being economy stuff. Thanks, Canada. A Canadian-born economist came up with this idea that economic growth is a poor measure of well-being, and now we have all this shit about a well-being economy that's being foisted on us. In 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson eschewed the pursuit of growth. Johnson, the same one who did the Great Society and basically devastated all of our racial minorities and created the circumstances that we see today in inner cities. That Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson eschewed the pursuit of growth because it measured quantity but not quality, meaning, or beauty. In 1968, U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy echoed this sentiment, quote, "Gross national product does not allow for the health of our children." Actually, yes, it does, because gross national product reflects how much energy you are producing, and energy allows you to solve problems, including the health of your children. So gross national product does actually allow for the health of your children because a rich society can afford to keep its children more healthy. But let's read Kennedy's words here. Gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does all of those. What the fuck are you talking about? It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. I'd love to know where he thinks poets and public intellectuals get their food, if not from a society that's producing excess. What the hell are you talking about? Marriages are more stable when they're not fighting over poverty. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. End quote. Thank you, Robert F. Kennedy, for that steaming pile of communist shit. Which, that's what that is. That's communist shit. It's trying to get you to devalue the idea of a prosperous society as the foundation for a successful, healthy, well-being society. When astronauts landed on the moon, Orr tells us, in 1969, the first images of Earth as a tiny blue marble drove home the idea that Earth was finite, fragile, and precious. New environmental organizations were created in the United States and Canada. President Nixon created the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1969, and the first Earth Day, which was directly a communist front project, took place on 22nd April 1970. In Canada, Pollution Probe was founded in 1969, the Canadian Environmental Law Association emerged in 1970, and Greenpeace, what a pile of shit that is, was founded in Vancouver in 1971 to oppose nuclear testing and whaling. Meanwhile, concerns about oil spills also seeped into Canada in 1970 when the tanker Arrow spilled oil into the Chedabucto Bay, Nova Scotia. I don't know if I said that right. Sorry, Nova Scotians. This growing environmental awareness intersected with the ideas of newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau about governing, providing the ingredients for a promising approach to environmental governance. Trudeau mania. How's that going for you today, guys? Trudeau mania gave the Liberals the confidence and initial momentum to try bold new ideas, and Trudeau, called the Philosopher King, was an intellectual prone to engaging with ambitious, idealistic proposals. Maybe you had one before, but Pierre Trudeau sounds like your Woodrow Wilson, who let the whole transformational, we'll call it, progressive cat out of the bag. And your Liberal Party, I think, ever since has at least been defined by this. It is a party of, therefore, destruction. It's Fabian socialism as opposed to outright revolutionary Marxism, but it's not any different. Moreover, that's Pierre Trudeau, and his inner circle, especially Michael Pitfield, Jim Davey, and Marc Lalonde, had been concerned about government disorganization and a lack of strategic planning during the Pearson era. Trudeau began the 1970s with a rational planning mandate. This meant significant government reforms intended to realize strategic planning and integration. These changes mirrored thinking in the United States and privileged scientific knowledge, objectivity, and long-term planning. Finally, Trudeau was elected in 1968 on the ideal of participatory democracy, and for the first time, each party was given a budget for policy research. As the 1970s began, leaders from the three major Canadian political parties were all oriented toward developing good policies rather than partisan politics. It's a perfect opportunity for a communist subversive to really drag things in a bad direction, by the way. With Trudeau's idealism, the government's rational planning mandate, with the political goodwill of participatory democracy, it's not surprising that the environment enjoyed initial enthusiasm. So let me just underscore here that, like I said, I think Pierre Trudeau was your Woodrow Wilson in Canada. Section A, Trudeau and the Club of Rome, the Problématique, Systems Thinking, and Limits to Growth. And this is the part that I really wanted to communicate to you. I mean, there's lots of other stuff in this paper, and you could read it for yourself, but this is the part that matters. When Trudeau mania swept across Canada in 1968, the Club of Rome, which would inspire Trudeau's environmental vision, had not yet been created. The organization, best known for commissioning the 1972 The Limits to Growth, was founded by Aurelio Pecci and Alexander King. Pecci, well, I think I'm saying that right. Pecci, I don't know. Pecci, we're saying Pecci, P-E-C-C-E-I in Italian. Do it your best. Pecci, that's what we're saying, was an Italian industrialist, and King was Director General for Scientific Affairs at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Pause. OECD is one of the demonic organizations that's causing all the problems in the world to this day. And you actually can hear at various points Chrystia Freeland talking about the OECD. I don't remember if it was in those two particular clips, but she references them too. They met in late 1967 after King encountered Pecci's ideas about intersecting global problems. In April 1968, Pecci and King brought together 20 leading industrialists, academics, and bureaucrats in the Villa Farnesina in Rome, after which the club would be named. In Rome, they discussed the Problematique, the idea that seemingly unrelated global problems were connected. In other words, they discussed the same thing the World Economic Forum was created to discuss in many respects and has become obsessed with. The great narrative for the better future that Klaus Schwab has put forth is that there exists the Problematique, many simultaneous, interrelated existential crises that are going to require global coordination and communism to solve. Quantitative growth, Orr tells us, had led to overpopulation. That's what they care most about. Environmental destruction, urban pollution, social discontent, and other problems. So what's the solution? Sustainability and inclusion. This is a Marxist wedge to start destroying our societies. It said it was as yet unclear how to connect these problems. That's because they hadn't developed the relevant Marxist politics yet. Although Pecci and King, I said it funny that time, although Pecci and King thought the meeting was a monumental flop, one participant, Eric Jansch, Jantsch, so important to look up Eric Jansch's model of systems. I will talk about that for a moment after I read a little bit. Although Pecci and King thought the meeting was a monumental flop, one participant, Eric Jansch, had outlined a framework to understand the world system. Building on this idea in his book, The Chasm Ahead, Pecci articulated the problematique and his emerging vision for how to address it. Let me talk about Jansch real quick. I've got this image I've had forever on my laptop, and I'd love to talk about it. So the Jansch pyramid basically is a systems thinking model where it's very hard to communicate this. Maybe I'll have to put the graphic on the video or something. I don't know. But it says that he's kind of the birthplace of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary, which you'll remember from my Strange Death of the University podcast series that UNESCO is pushing. Same ideas. Well, they got this from somebody I didn't realize at the time is Eric Jansch. Okay, so multidisciplinary says there's no coordination. It says ecology, selection, silviculture, economics, productivity. It shows nothing connected. But then interdisciplinarity 1 is that these different domains are now coordinated by a higher level concept. This is like my idea where I've said the necessity of theology, which is to bind and orient different schools of thought and point them toward the good, the true, and the beautiful. Well, the communists understand the idea of binding and orienting them. That's called systems thinking, and they point it toward their own power instead. So now you have economic liberalism in this picture becomes an overarching model with arrows pointing both directions, connecting the various pieces, stand, rotation, productivity, and so on. I don't know why in the hell it has those words, but they're now all connected, and they are coordinated by a higher level concept, which interdisciplinarity 2 is where they take this concept and redirect it into something different, in this case, sustainability. So you have ecosystem, biodiversity, productivity, all being interbalanced with one another and coordinated and driven by the higher level concept of sustainability. And then transdisciplinarity is where the Jansch pyramid really starts to take off, multi-level coordination by a shared goal. So it gives the example, it shows an arrow coming into a pyramid, an arrow going out of the pyramid, and it says, at the very top, sustainable forest management. So that's going to require coordination through silviculture and sustainability science, which are coordinating with each other. And silviculture is going to require working together with economics and ecology, while sustainability science has to look at philosophy and sociology. And all of these things are interacting all at once. In other words, what they get to do is they get to mix and match all of the different schools of thought in the world into a single school of thought that they happen to be the only ones who understand it. And it's all put in terms of a goal or a driving vision at the top, that happens to be the thing that they set. So when I gave the lectures I've given about theology and its role in binding and orienting different schools of thought and philosophy, that's what they're doing. But my claim was that theology, by definition, because it's based on theos, which means God, has to point at the good, the true, and the beautiful, whereas what they're doing is creating a systems approach that is binding and orienting various schools of thought and coordinating them to point them at their vision of the world, which means their own power. So that's where we are. That's who this is. This is invoked here. So the systems thinker of systems thinkers, who happened to be at the Club of Rome meeting in the first place, happens to be the guy who's laid out the model of transdisciplinarity that all of their bullshit is based off of, which is their equivalent of kind of quasi-academic theology for their systems thinking, or AKA communist religion. Okay, so anyway, the problematique, we go on, the problematique framed the global predicament of humankind in holistic terms, just like the World Economic Forum does in the Great Narrative for a Better Future. It's the same stuff. It's just all rehashed and stolen from each other. Individual features were inherently connected and thus required an integrated systems approach. Of course it did. A systems approach involved a holistic worldview of world problems, looking at the interconnections among those problems and attempting to understand the long-term dynamics of the world system. That's communism. Do you understand? That's communism. This approach would begin with a, quote, multinationally sponsored feasibility study on the systematic long-term planning of world scope, end quote, using systems dynamics modeling. Systems dynamics modeling would use innovative new computer methods to capture the nonlinear relationships among variables of the system. In other words, they can run computer models that generate a bunch of bullshit that they can say some bad thing is going to happen unless we tweak the system, and only we know how the system works because only we have the model, and so we're going to start tweaking the system, give us the power to do it. These methods, they say, would be able to model the feedbacks and dynamic responses that emerged from those relationships, but addressing the problematique also required an act of political will. So that's why we need to remake people, so you can have the political will to create the mass line to drive the transformation. The Club of Rome began reaching out to political leaders to raise awareness about the problematique and gain support for its approach to long-term planning, which, by the way, includes reducing the population, reducing the standard of living, and redistributing the produced value in the world. As Pietri and King were formulating their ideas, they quietly reached out to Trudeau and the Canadian government. Oh, from 1969, that's before they wrote, until at least the late 1970s, there were ongoing communications with the Club of Rome, support for its activities, and consideration of its ideas by senior levels of the Canadian federal government, including Trudeau, the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council's office, members of the Liberal cabinet, senators, and the Governor General. I would extend that to the majority of the Liberal Party, as a matter of fact. On 15-16 June 1969, founding members of the Club of Rome, including Pietri and King, first met with Trudeau. That's before they published, 3 years before they published their book, okay? So they were already meeting with Trudeau. They already knew that they had, through Pierre Trudeau, Canadian buy-in to their program before they wrote their book. So Canada, through Trudeau, was betraying the world with this weirdo communist death cult. But anyway, on 15-16 June 1969, founding members of the Club of Rome, including Pietri and King, first met with Trudeau and members of the Canadian government. This meeting included members of the PMO, the PCO, representatives from the Science Secretariat, the SCC, the Department of External Affairs, the Department of National Defense, and Senator Maurice Lemantang. Lemantang. We're going with Lemantang. You guys can fix it. On 16 June 1969, an informal dinner included Trudeau. Pietri and King argued, quote, nothing short of a comprehensive systems approach on a worldwide basis can be fully effective. In other words, we can't solve these problems that we say are going to affect the world unless we have global governance that we're all in control of, using so-called systems thinking, aka Marxism, as the guiding light. In other words, hi, Pietri and King said to Trudeau, I'm the Antichrist. The apocalypse is coming, and we can work together to stop it. They identified the need to understand these problems through forecasting and systems analysis. Yeah, just like they did with COVID. Pecci emphasized the political nature of these problems and the need for a, quote, act of political will. He specifically requested Canada's leadership to initiate global efforts to address the problematique and provide financial support. Remember, this is before they wrote their book. He specifically requested Canada's leadership, that's Pierre Trudeau in the Prime Minister's seat, and the Liberal government around him and his Liberal cabinet, to initiate global efforts to address the problematique and provide financial support to study the problem. In other words, now the Canadian government, just like Chrystia Freeland said for the convergence, there will be $25 million. She said, what did she say? $25 million of Canadian government money. No. Taxpayer money. Your money. We're not playing. The government doesn't have any money. The government has taxpayer money. The government has money they took from working people in the country. Okay? You can argue about the validity of taxes all you want. It doesn't matter. The government doesn't have any money. Zero fucking money. Zero. They have taxpayer money. And that is what, to this convergence program in 2016 that Chrystia Freeland was talking about, in exactly the same line as what we're talking about here through the Club of Rome. And in 1969, for the launching of the Club of Rome's ambition to tackle the problematique, was going to be Canadian taxpayer money, very clearly. A memorandum, it says, for Trudeau about these meetings states, quote, Pecci made it clear that he and his colleagues were seeking a political initiative to create such a group. One country would take the lead and gain the moral and financial support of several others in its creation. Pecci gave a number of reasons why he believes Canada is the optimum choice for a country to take such initiative, end quote. Pecci said that a Canadian-led initiative was the, quote, best imaginable because Canada had an, quote, untarnished record. Trudeau was known to be open-minded. Other countries looked to Canada for leadership, and it was considered, quote, considered a country of independent thinking in a constructive sense, end quote. They were taking advantage of the best qualities of Canadians, in other words, plus Pierre Trudeau and Trudeau mania. Pecci's strategy was to contact and bring together a group of, quote, more neutral, smaller countries, not just a, quote, club for the rich, and then bring on broad Cold War superpowers in the United States and the USSR. Pecci proposed that Canada approach one or two other countries to see if they were interested in co-sponsoring the work. Emphasizing Canadian leadership, quote, he proposed unequivocally that Canada take the primary initiative. So basically, the Great Reset version 1.0 was pitched to Canada, and that Canada should go start doing a multi-level marketing scam on other countries outside of the US and USSR to start trying to build a snowball effect to support the building of the Club of Rome, which is, as we've heard, a communist death cult. So how are they received? Well, Orr tells us these ideas fit well with the Trudeau government's thinking, and Pecci's proposal was received with interest at the highest levels of government. Trudeau's advisors recommended to him that Canada either accept Pecci's request or agree to participate but leave the initiative to another country. Program Secretary to the Prime Minister, J.M. Davey, recommended that Canada support the Club of Rome's proposal rather than reject it, arguing, quote, the proposed problems are real, and that, quote, this is the type of imaginative approach that fits very well with the nature and style of the current administration. That's Pierre Trudeau's administration, by the way. Robert Uffin, Chief Science Advisor to the Cabinet, Science Secretariat in the PCO, and member of the Club of Rome, so you've got some cross-pollination there, 1970s Canada, was designated as the correspondent between the Club of Rome and Canada. Trudeau's government continued to engage with and support the Club of Rome's activities. On 5th January 1970, a second meeting was held between members of the Club of Rome, the PMO, Trudeau, and senior Liberals. Your Liberal Party is a problem, Canadians. The NDP is worse, but your Liberals are a problem. 4 attendees of this meeting, Gendron, Stadelman, Lemontang, you can figure out how to say it yourself, and Whitehead became the first Canadian members of the Club of Rome. Oh, look at that. The Club of Rome was being built out after discussing with Canada whether or not it would finance the research for it and get behind it and get other people involved. And then 4 attendees of a meeting between the Club of Rome, the PMO, Trudeau, and senior Liberals became the first Canadian members of the Club of Rome. When Whitehead was hesitant to become a member because of potential conflict of interest, Trudeau expressed that Whitehead's membership was compatible with his responsibilities as principal science advisor in the PCO because it would enable Trudeau to keep in touch with the activities of the Club of Rome. Whitehead could suggest ways the Canadian government could help the club. As a result, Canada was one of the first countries to create a national association for the Club of Rome and to host a full meeting of the Club of Rome. On 6 April 1971, the Trudeau government sponsored the Club of Rome's second meeting, held in Montebello, Quebec. Montebello was a critical moment in the development of the Club of Rome's thinking. This is before they published their book, guys. And members of Trudeau's cabinet, the PMO, the PCO, and the Governor General attended the meeting. Until 1970, the Club of Rome had only articulated their thinking in 3 points: a long-term focus, problems of a global scope, and the problématique as a complex of interconnected problems. The Club of Rome had commissioned a team at MIT, led by Jay Forrester, to model the long-term interactions of major world dynamics using systems dynamics. Communism. At Montebello, the MIT team presented its preliminary results. The MIT team's model used system dynamics and had 5 variables: population, food production, industrialization, pollution, and the consumption of non-renewable natural resources. As I already explained, they had grotesquely unrealistic assumptions about all of these. The model captured the nonlinear relationships and feedbacks between the variables to produce scenarios up to 2100. Turns out that almost all of their predictions by the year 2000 were completely wrong. So I'm sure their predictions out to 2100 are even better. Without changes to historical growth trends, these scenarios predicted, quote, sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity, end quote. Yeah, they predicted we run out of copper, for example, by the year 2000, which turns out we didn't. And even if we were to start becoming short on copper, I already explained how the innovation pressure comes into play. Figuring out a alternative or a way to get copper price down or whatever becomes a high priority, a very lucrative priority, and is highly incentivized in a free market. Outside of these doomsday control freaks that run death cults who actually will end up just killing people over stupid programs. We could talk about, for example, when Mao decided that there was this parasite that was killing all these Chinese and it was a really big problem. So he went and started having people gather the snails that carried the parasite, and the next thing you know, all these people died, and it actually made the problem worse. Always stuff like that. So there's going to be like the shortage of copper, and so everybody, if these people are in charge, everybody's going to have to like turn over various, things made of metal so they can extract all the copper because we need it, and you have to do your part. And so there's going to be a lot of confiscation of property, a lot of destruction of property, so on and so forth. Communism, it always looks like this. But anyway, sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity, which, P.S., their plan is literally to do decline in both population and industrial capacity so that we can allegedly avoid sudden and uncontrollable decline. That's really their plan. Decrease the population and their standard of living so we don't overstretch our resources, which would cause a collapse. That's their literal problematique polycrisis, or whatever words we're going to use. The polycrisis, by the way, is the 2024 word for problematique from 1970. At this meeting, the concept of limits to growth was first conceived and discussed. Thus, the Trudeau government was party to and supported the early Club of Rome discussions and activities even before the 1972 publication, Limits to Growth. Section B, Trudeau's environmental vision, systems thinking, questioning growth, and societal values. Oh, societal values, you like inner work, just like the Club of Rome today. These early exchanges between the Club of Rome and the Trudeau government were mirrored in Canadian environmental thinking and policy. So the Club of Rome was born partly through working with Pierre Trudeau in Canada, and in turn, their ideas influenced Canadian environmental governance policy. Concerns about disorganization and a lack of strategic planning led Trudeau, along with senior bureaucrat Michael Pitfield, to oversee significant government reorganizations within the PCO and cabinet, among other government organizations. Trudeau and his inner circle, including Michael Pitfield, Jim Davey, Marc Lalonde, and Ivan Head, became increasingly interested in systems analysis and futurology as a solution. This is communist Bullshit. Echoing ideas raised in meetings with the Club of Rome, the Pitfield-Trudeau approach reflected the belief that it was possible to plan the future rationally based on an analytical understanding of society. Let me tell y'all, every single time human beings have decided you can do that, lots of people die. Every single time. Central planning doesn't work. Trudeau's rational planning mandate, which sounded so good before, didn't it, when we used those words before? Trudeau's rational planning mandate recognized the interrelationships, there's a complexity appeal, among issues and reflected holistic systems thinking that proposed a horizontal approach to government decision-making. In other words, committee approach. Trudeau, along with Pitfield, sought to implement systems principles through government reforms, and this was especially true for environmental governance. They approached the environment not as a separate problem to be dealt with by an isolated ministry, but as a systemic problem requiring society-wide efforts. That is, your participation is required, comrade. It's a totalitarian program. Trudeau encouraged proposals for a Department of the Environment with a comprehensive mandate as an ecosystem manager that would challenge economic planning assumptions and add the missing ecological feedback loop. As C.R. Nixon originally conceived, the DOE was intended to be a horizontal organization. It would review initiatives of other departments that affected the environment and report to cabinet, where its feedback would have influence. In other words, it was just a means to insert Club of Rome concepts and Liberal Party members in positions of controlling other aspects of the government. It was a power grab. The new ministry, that uses the environment as the excuse, the new ministry, quote, would take a broad ecological perspective in the discharge of its responsibilities and in particular take the lead in the enhancement of the quality of our environment, end quote. Trudeau emphasized that, quote, the fight against the pollution of our environment is far beyond the capacity of one minister and his department. Indeed, it cannot be waged effectively by the federal government alone. It is a fight that must be waged by all ministers, all governments, and all people, end quote. Comrade, your participation is required. Hence, as initially envisioned, addressing environmental problems required a systems approach that accounted for feedbacks as well as cooperation from all departments and society at large. So let me break this down out of the gobbledygook and just tell you what that means. What that means is they set up a powerful government bureaucracy that would not only be able to constrain the way that the government acts, but that would compel the participation of all aspects of the government and society, including businesses and people. In other words, they created a vast totalitarian instrument, bureaucratic instrument for their government. That's the legacy of Trudeau. That was the mission of the Liberal Party in coordinating with the Club of Rome, which we again have heard is a communist death cult. A systems approach, Orr says, to addressing environmental issues was reflected not only in the Department of Environment, but also in the creation of the Ministry of State for Science and Technology, the Ministry of State for Urban Affairs. Both urban issues in science and technology had risen on the public and political agendas throughout the 1960s, and ministries of state were a Trudeau-era invention that embodied system-wide integration. In other words, this bureaucracy was now going to sprawl further to compel more behavior now and to deal with science and technology, but also urban affairs. In contrast to traditional line departments, they were to behave as horizontal agencies, bureaucracies that is, similar to central institutions such as the PCO, PMO, and Treasury Board. For example, all federal departments involved in science activity would maintain contact with the MOSST, which would coordinate activities and provide overall direction, while line departments had more cumbersome administrative structures and levels of responsibility. Ministries of state were intended to have power and influence, and also to be more flexible and efficient by focusing on one policy area. On 24 October 1969, Trudeau declared, quote, "We intend to tackle the problem of environment by directing our efforts mainly at the two major sources of pollution, urbanization and the invasion of modern technology," end quote. So Alberta, there's your oil and gas and all the modern technology, I guess. For Trudeau, unplanned urbanization and the rampant use of technology were too often employed to, quote, "challenge man's own survival." In so doing, he threatens not only his own species, but also the whole of life on our planet, end quote. That's straight Club of Rome right there. Trudeau's environmental concerns about the management of technology would lead to the establishment of MOSST, with prominent businessman Alistair Gillespie as its first Minister of State. while Trudeau's concerns about urbanization would lead to the creation of the MSUA. This system's view of environmental problems was realized when the Government Organization Act, Bill C-207, was tabled on 27 January 1971. It created the DOE as well as two ministries of state, MOSST and MSUA. In other words, again, this sprawling, interconnected bureaucracy that's going to enforce not just on the government, but on society at large, including people and businesses. Do I need to read a lot of this? I'm trying to figure out how much more of this I need to read. This says Club of Rome. Let's go. MOSST in particular was conceived of and molded by systems thinkers and Club of Rome members J.R. Whitehead and C.R. Nixon, among others in the PCO. In 1971, MOSST was given the responsibility of both the Science Secretariat and the SSC from the PCO, and Whitehead became the Assistant Secretary for MOSST. So remember, he was a Club of Rome member, is now the Assistant Secretary for it. Gillespie himself attended the Montebello meeting and was a supporter of systems thinking and integration of economic and environmental issues. Upon reading Limits to Growth, he summarized its conclusions as, quote, so far-reaching and raised so many questions for further study that we are quite frankly overwhelmed by the enormity of the job that must be done, end quote. Too bad it was all bullshit, dude, and you got taken for a ride, or you just cynically used it. He wrote that he hoped for other people and countries, quote, to join us in understanding and preparing for a period of great transition from growth to global equilibrium, end quote. And so that explains all of your Alberta energy policy right there. MOSST became, quote, a major sponsor of Club of Rome and CACOR, Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, initiatives, end quote. Funding, for instance, a major 1978 Club of Rome report. Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. The last thing, let me just say it again. So MOSST became a major sponsor for Club of Rome and Canadian Association for Club of Rome initiatives, and it went on to fund, for instance, a major 1978 Club of Rome report. So Canadians did end up funding the development of their first major rehash on Limits to Growth, which was probably called like Beyond Limits to Growth or More Limits to Growth, or I forgot what it's called. I think they're at Beyond Growth now, and now we've got Earth for All. Gillespie would later attempt to integrate energy and environmental issues during a second term leading MOSST. Within this overarching view of environmental problems, the economy-environment relationship and the compatibility of economic growth with the environment were central themes. On 27 January 1971, Minister of Fisheries and Forests Jack Davis, soon to be the first Minister of Environment, announced, quote, our new Department of the Environment puts the emphasis on quality rather than quantity. It must put ecology ahead of economics whenever a choice has to be made between the two. However, ecology and economics are not always opposed. We can have economic growth and a healthy environment too, but to have maximum economic growth and a sound environment will take a lot of doing, end quote. For Davis, tensions between economic growth and the environment required a rethinking of economic growth as a primary policy objective. So that's your standards of living coming down in the name of the environment, which they mismanage anyway. Quote, economic growth in the old-fashioned quantitative sense is an illusion. It is short-sighted. It is narrowly conceived. It recognizes certain private costs but ignores others. It passes hidden charges on to others, and these hidden charges can turn up later in the form of barren soil, smoke-laden skies, and waters which are repulsive to all of us. A fuller accounting of the costs and benefits over the long run inevitably turns up a different balance sheet. Blighted landscapes and unhappy hours are negative factors that must be taken into account, end quote. So that's actually relatively reasonable, but you can see the pretext for grasping tons of control that's not reasonable, that actually harms Canadian citizens in the name of their stupid systems approach, which always has to be right because they are the only ones who understand the system, and if their approach is wrong, then they were wrong, so they must always be right. Thus, who? The Liberal government of the early 1970s explicitly adopted a systems approach, that means communist, considered the relationship between economic growth and the environment and embraced new measures of well-being. So the well-being economy, which is the Marxist measurement of success these days, was being forged in the early 1970s Liberal government of Canada. Paralleling the Club of Rome system approach and drawing together developments in long-established but previously siloed environmental domains, Trudeau produced an ambitious system of environmental laws. Trudeau's 1969 Thorn speech initiated the creation of a system of environmental protection composed of 5 new environmental statutes that would later be merged into the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. One example of the transformative potential of these laws was the 1972 bilateral Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement set an ambitious goal of zero discharge of persistent toxic substances into the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, making it one of the earliest international agreements to adopt an ecosystem approach. Another example that had transformative potential was the 1975 Environmental Contaminants Act, which regulated toxic substances used in manufacturing inputs rather than merely regulating end-of-pipe pollution. Indeed, as legal scholars assert, quote, the intensity of environmental law reform in Canada has never matched the first wave of activity in the 1970s, end quote, which is when it was working specifically with the Club of Rome. C. Questioning economic growth on environmental grounds. Very Club of Rome. In addition to their attempts to implement a systems approach and support the Club of Rome's efforts, Trudeau and his inner circle publicly and repeatedly challenged the pursuit of unconstrained economic growth on environmental grounds. So here we see the birth of environmentalism or climate change being a power broker in order for them to control business and individuals. In a May 1971 speech, Trudeau expressed concern about the rape of natural resources. That's a joke we literally put in the Conceptual Penis as a social construct hoax paper. Concern about the rape of natural resources and, quote, decried foolish worship of the gross national product, end quote. Which we've already covered why that is evil communism. Echoing the Club of Rome's critique of modern industrial economy, which would be echoing a neo-Malthusian and quasi-Marxist critique of modern industrial economy. He emphasized that the government should pay attention to the negative impacts of human activities such as pollution, resource exhaustion, and the social cost of overcrowding. So pollution, yeah, probably. Resource exhaustion, I mean, give it some thought, but it's not as huge of a deal as they make it. That's a huge control mechanism. And the social cost of overcrowding, they just use that to leverage whatever they want. We come back to the housing reform that we started this podcast with. He argued that these impacts could be better measured as net human benefit than as GNP. At least some of the Liberal Party supported Trudeau's rejection of GNP and advocacy of net human benefit. When Trudeau supported him at an I don't know why I just blinked on this. When Trudeau supported him at an all-candidates meeting in Victoria, BC Liberal Member of Parliament David Gruss declared his agreement with Trudeau, quote, that nations should stop their reckless climbing for incessantly higher production, which translates to standard of living, by the way, and should replace the concept of gross national product with that of net human benefit, end quote. Of course, they would measure net human benefit, and you can benefit with very little, according to every neo-Marxist. Ivan Head, special assistant to Trudeau, publicly reiterated this position. Quote, the philosophy of unrestricted growth has been challenged by his government. Gross national product as the determining measurement of the health of a society has been called into question, and net human benefit has been suggested as a substitute, a measurement which would take into account such factors as environmental deterioration, community overcrowding, and resource depletion, end quote. Now, we know how these actual measurements work. They cook up some index, next we'll call it the net human benefit index, and they decide kind of to their own purposes, what counts. This environment is degraded, maybe it's the northern wastes and nobody actually goes there, but that would actually take away if somebody did. So now what we have to do is shut down oil and gas production in northern Alberta or central Alberta. This is the kind of thing that they do. These are pretexts for them to control things from their sprawling bureaucracy, which is the recipe of totalitarianism. Trudeau substantiated these ideas in 1972 when he appointed Sylvia Austrie as the chief statistician for Statistics Canada. She was charged with augmenting and improving the national accounts so that they would include social welfare and the environmental impacts of economic activity. So they would include inclusion and sustainability, the new religion. A group was created in Statistics Canada to research ways to interrelate orthodox economic statistics with environmental indicators. In sum, throughout his first term, there was a significant interaction between the Trudeau government and the Club of Rome. Trudeau considered and attempted to implement these ideas, including a systems approach, through government reforms, the creation of the DOE, MOSST, and MSUA, and a system of environmental laws. He also initiated development of alternative measures of well-being in Statistics Canada and called for new values in society, which is what the Club of Rome is calling for, with Canadians included today. Together, these ideas and initiatives reflect a transformative vision of environmental governance, in other words, a communist vision. The next section is Section 3, Rising Tensions in an Increasingly Unsettled Time, 1968 to 1973. I'm not going to go through how all of this didn't really work out and how involved the Liberal Party was at the time with Club of Rome and Club of Rome thinking, systems thinking, and so on. Here's just like a flavor sentence, but I'm just going to skip all this and go down to the conclusion. While Trudeau had surrounded himself with intellectuals and system thinkers in his first term, after 1972, he replaced them with politically minded advisors with expertise from the Pearson era. Advocates of systems thinking who had been party to discussions with the Club of Rome were sidelined. Marc Lalonde became Minister of National Health and Welfare, Jim Davey was moved to the Department of Transport, and Michael Pitfield was moved to a deputy minister post in 1973, although he returned in 1975. Other systems thinkers had already left, Whitehead to MOSST, and Uffin to Queen's University. Instead, Trudeau brought on seasoned political advisor Keith Davey to run his 1974 campaign and Jim Coots to handle the media. Blah, blah, blah. So what it's talking about there is that because of the pressures and him almost losing his election was it 74, I guess, or 72 maybe, I'm sorry, Pierre Trudeau strongly reorganized his priorities and he went much more political. It's like how Obama was the other way around. Obama was like really kind of trying to middle of the road it as much as he could fake it through 2008 to 12, and he went full radical in 2012 because he was unleashing the cultural Marxist program. But I'm not going to, like I said, read all of this. But there was challenges, the OPEC crisis, and other things that basically pushed Trudeau's Club of Rome visions to the sideline. But even so, Section 4 begins, this is called Continued Environmental Aspirations in the Context of Stagflation and the Energy Crisis, 73 to 79. Trudeau continued to entertain environmental ideas and meet with the Club of Rome, albeit less frequently. For instance, on 4-5 February 1974, even in the midst of the OPEC crisis and with a fragile minority, he attended the Club of Rome Salzburg Conference for Heads of State. Held in Salzburg, Austria, the conference was a meeting between members of the Club of Rome and the political leaders of 10 countries or their personal representatives. It focused on political aspects of addressing the problematique. Preparatory documents foregrounded limits to growth and problematized the, quote, dramatic growth of the world economy and accumulation of wealth, especially in industrialized countries, end quote. What do you think they're after? At Pecci's invitation, Trudeau attended the conference. And it could go on, but the point is that all along, he was a major in major cahoots with the Club of Rome, right? So what does this say? Trudeau and his staff expressed concerns about public attention in a public declaration. A restricted telegram from Ivan Head to the Club of Rome states that, quote, Prime Minister is concerned that the idea of a common declaration and an attendant publicity could inspire attention and comment, which would take away from the value of meeting in addition to involving participants' unwelcome exercise of reaching agreement. Grateful if you would contact Pecci immediately and discover his precise intentions. You may indicate the Prime Minister's interest in having this information. And then it says here that at this point, Pierre Trudeau's main interest was political survival. Political survival was a main concern during this approach. A founding member of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, R.J. Whitehead, observed that heads of state, quote, were all convinced that their political survival was at stake if they initiated the measures that are essential for global survival. Isn't that the same as the G7 today? Some ministers might have been prepared to make the sacrifice except for the fact that their probable successors had less knowledge of global problems and were less sympathetic towards solutions than they were, so the situation would not be improved by their resignation. End quote. According to one account, quote, Trudeau spoke at the end of the meeting to the effect that he certainly agreed with the critical nature of the issues identified, but if he, as Prime Minister, tried to implement the required action as identified by the group, he would be out of office at the next election or before. And furthermore, if he were voted out of office, his successor would be faced with the same problem. Hello, history rhyming. There's Pierre Trudeau saying, oh my God, if we actually do this shit that we've been doing, they're going to destroy my political career. If I actually implement this, they're going to kick me out. And guess what? Now we face his son, who is in exactly the same position. And guess what you should do? Kick him the hell out. Kick his whole party out. The Liberal Party, and again, NDP is worse, needs to be absolutely destroyed over these agendas that they've been running over the entire last 50 years of Canadian history. This isn't stuff to fool around with. This is, I'm not joking, I'm not exaggerating. This is our Canadian friends starving in the dark while they freeze to death. I mean, this is where this goes. But it says these long-term concerns about the environment and the global situation remain politically sensitive and were not voiced publicly. So a huge amount of public outcry to this crap was actually able to put the kibosh on it to a degree. And it goes on and on. I'm not going to continue with all this. I want to see if there was something in the conclusion, if I remember right. It's really, I mean, there's still quite a lot of paper here going all the way to 92 or 82, I'm sorry. The 1970s, this is from the conclusion, was not only a decade characterized by perpetual problems, but also a unique period of environmental thinking and integration. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Trudeau and his government met with the Club of Rome and supported its activities. So why wouldn't WEF stooge and Castro crybaby Justin Trudeau not have the exact same priorities as his father, even which he clearly displays in front of Canada all the time? And that is the subscription to this communist death cult. Trudeau and his government met with the Club of Rome and supported its activities. That's really a sentence. And Canadian environmental governance in the 1970s embodied greater aspirations and transformative, aka communist, ideas than previously thought. Trudeau and his administration attempted to implement a systems approach, communism, communist bureaucracy, repeatedly questioned economic growth on environmental grounds, in other words, try to get rid of a high standard of living in the name of the environment, and proposed net human benefit, aka well-being economy, as an alternative, which of course they would measure and decide what's actually good for you and what you actually need, and then how well off you are while you own nothing and are happy, and you freeze to death while you starve in the dark. Trudeau's approach to environmental governance embedded systems thinking through institutional reforms and environmental laws. So throughout the government, because of the Liberal Party and Pierre Trudeau in the 1960s and 1970s, your government was transformed to systems thinking programs. Luckily, that got walked back some later. During his first term, Trudeau was not wedded to the growth imperative. He and his administration critiqued economic growth and supported development of new ways of measuring well-being at Statistics Canada. His government also recognized the need for societal support and called for new values. It's exactly what the Club of Rome is doing now with their giant leap forward or backwards, I guess. Together, these elements reflect a transformative approach to environmental government. And he goes on to say that none of this really worked, but it would be great if we did. Let me see what the last sentence or last paragraphs say. In broad perspective, the 1970s were a missed opportunity. Trudeau's rhetoric on the environment was ambitious, but its realization in policy and practice was lacking. And if you remember, that's because of all these other conditions where we hadn't had a global spiritual transformation of people into sustainable and inclusive global citizens. In other words, the thing the Club of Rome is still pushing today, that Chrystia Freeland's convergence is still pushing today, at her inflection point where allegedly people in Canada are sitting around their dinner table questioning if capitalist democracy works for them. At the same time, Trudeau's calls for a new ethic and ecological consciousness may have fallen on deaf ears. See, we hadn't have a transformed population yet. Were Canadians overwhelmed by persistent problems and not yet ready for the changes proposed by the Trudeau government? Good thing his son is going to step in and fulfill that dream. Trudeau ultimately failed to help Canada renegotiate the relationship between society and nature. In the face of compounding pressures and overwhelming crises, the search for an ecologically benign environment relationship was a casualty. In other words, they couldn't put in their sustainable and inclusive model yet. We weren't ready for degrowth, and the people didn't let him do it. Much has changed, they say, in the intervening years to make the transformative environmental vision of Pierre Elliott Trudeau more feasible through the vehicle of his so-called son. The false promise that economic growth will deliver societal well-being, so there's a Marxist lie, and protect ecological integrity has been laid bare, by Marxist liars. Free markets, globalization, and technological innovation have proven insufficient to address environmental problems, so they say, but more importantly, so they've convinced millions of Canadians to believe. The science on climate change is clear. What it should say, the science on climate change is clearly a fucking hoax, and we understand the long-term implications of inaction. Yeah, you won't get your fucking power grab. You won't have your global tyranny that you're using Canadian taxpayer dollars and manpower to fund. Environmental education and public support have increased, so they've got more brainwashing going on, and as a result, there are some values changed. And he says, still at its core, the global problematique, remember that's the beating heart of the polycrisis, is at its core, the global problematique remains a political predicament of collective values. Leadership and action. In other words, communist transformation. That's why they keep using the word transformative, because it's communist transformation. For whatever it's worth, I don't know if this is worth anything, this research was supported by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Doctoral Fellowship 752-2015-2404. Partial funding was also provided by the Economics for the Anthropocene Research Partnership at McGill University. The author would also like to thank 3 anonymous reviewers for their insightful comments. So that's this paper. That's Pierre Trudeau's relationship with the Club of Rome, along with an introduction to how awful the Club of Rome is, and its goal is to transform the value systems in order to turn us into a global death cult under their command. And Canada is still now and has been for 50 years ass deep in this, thanks specifically to Pierre Trudeau, who we can assume is bastard son, also, I guess it's an anti-bastard son, is also committed to. This is actually extremely simple. We see it in the rhetoric of Justin Trudeau. We see it in the rhetoric of Chrystia Freeland. We see it echoed in their actions, which threaten the livelihoods and way of life of every Canadian. And as an American, you might say, well, why do you care, James? You're an American. Like, yeah, I'm an American. I'm awesome because America is awesome. I get it. Why would I care? Well, I don't fucking want a giant communist country on my northern border. That's one. How about that? I don't need you guys making an allyship with China to where you just become like a land bridge to flood North America with Chinese soldiers. I mean, we're letting enough of them in through the southern border as it is. And besides, I actually like you guys. I actually like Canadians. You Canucks are a good time. I don't want to see you and your country destroyed. I don't want you driven into the poverty, the starvation, the failure, the famine, the death that this will surely cause to come to be. Because it's, as the Club of Rome in May of 2024, a few months ago, said, it is a giant leap in some direction or another, just like Mao's Great Leap Forward. We're seeing exact parallels, not just of Maoist tactics, but of Maoist programs. We're seeing the same kinds of purges for wrongthink. We're seeing the same kinds of purges of the scientific establishment, of the journalistic establishment, of everyday people. We're seeing purges from the professional realms, just like we saw with Mao. And we're seeing an implementation of reform projects that mirror the catastrophic so-called reform projects of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1950s and the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. I'm concerned. I'm concerned for a large variety of reasons. And in my opinion, it's high time that we get up off of our asses and save Canada. So I wanted to share this with you, and I hope it was informative. And I guess, I mean, kind of like with dual meaning, like both meanings, right? Like the patriotic one, but also like the lament. It's like, oh, Canada. Oh, Canada. I hope we can turn it around. I really did mean it when I started off saying that I went to Alberta, and I find it to be an extraordinary inspiration. I very much enjoy my time in Alberta, at least that part of Canada. It's been very great. I would hate to see that succumb to this evil. And I extrapolate that to the other provinces of Canada that I haven't visited yet, and even to the provinces that are struggling even more that I have visited, particularly Ontario. I think that it's time for Canadians to wake up, but that's really the point of this podcast. This is a silly kind of paper, but this connection to the Club of Rome for your environmental policy going back to before the Club of Rome even existed, that it was using Canada as the lever to get itself off the ground, that's important. That matters. That's why Canada's struggling the way that Canada's struggling today. And if you have a path to solve this problem, kick the fucking Liberals out of power. They've been abusing your country for 50 years. And don't let the NDP in either. I'm not necessarily advocating for the Conservatives, but by exclusion, I think we're left with that. The problem specifically is that the Liberal Party has been destroying your country in line with the Club of Rome's death cult. The problem is that the NDP are crazy communists. Those two parties are destroying your country. You have to take responsibility, get politically involved, and make this stop. And you can save Canada. And we can have all the hockey jokes that we want across the border forever.